the things that we sort of have to keep in mind, which is it's a difficult reality to kind of confront, and that is that there's actually no such thing as a wrongful conviction. What there is there's incompetent or malicious prosecution, or there might be incompetent or maliciously negligent defense. But every conviction is legitimate in the sense that the trier of fact is making the best decision they can based on the evidence that is provided.
People on both sides of this justice system and all its flaws feel like they are doing the good work. The prosecutors feel like they are avenging victims of crime and they're helping to clean up the streets, and the defense attorneys feel all the time like they are representing innocent people from, poor minorities from unnecessary or unwarranted scrutiny and prosecution.
I mean, I think those are the big picture reasons. I mean, if you want to get down to what everybody cites to, well, there's mistaken eyewitness identification. There's false confessions. There are lying jailhouse misinformants. There's prosecutorial or other state misconduct. There's perjured testimony.
In my judgment, the number one cause of erroneous convictions is an original trial occurring in a criminal jurisdiction that is overwhelmed. It happens in a criminal jurisdiction where they don't have the resources that they need, they don't have the personnel, they don't have the budget to deal with the influx of cases that are coming through the courtroom, that are having to be investigated by the police detectives and so forth. They just can't keep up with it. And so what happens when you have that set of circumstances in place is that you have a criminal justice system that, instead of looking very carefully and thoughtfully at the evidence and the way that that evidence is being presented and the way that that defendant or the accused individual is being brought through the system, you have a situation where they've turned it into an assembly line.
Back to kind of the nuts and bolts of what caused a wrongful conviction, certainly tunnel vision, of which I guess implicit bias is related, tunnel vision, in which the police decide who it is they're going to convict and then emphasize everything that supports their theory and discount and dismiss everything that doesn't support their theory so that they get to the end that they've already determined they're going to get to is a large part of why innocent people are convicted.
We know that juries put a lot of weight on forensic evidence. It's been called the CSI effect in the past, that it's actually been researched, the impact that these television shows have on juries. But when you have a situation where forensic evidence is creating confusion or it's just flat out inaccurate, then it can have more of an impact, more of a negative impact on the outcome of that case than perhaps other causes. But I think, fortunately, the vast majority of the time, forensic evidence is pretty accurate. If it hadn't been for the claims that were made by innocence activists, by the Innocence Project, a lot of us in forensic science, I don't think, would have made the improvements that we have made over the last 20 years. And there's a part of me that doesn't like admitting to that, because I don't like dishonesty. But by the same token, I think as a profession we had gotten complacent, and I don't think we're trying as hard as we should to earn people's trust, to want to earn people's trust, and not just walk into a courtroom and just have everybody believe us because we feel entitled to be believed. And so, like when I teach my expert witnessing workshops, one of the things that I tell my students is I want you to want to be scrutinized, and I want you to want to have to earn people's trust. I don't want you to walk into a courtroom thinking that, oh, they're all going to believe me because I'm a forensic scientist and I deserve to be believed. Well, it doesn't work that way anymore. It did when I got into the profession in the early 90s, but it doesn't anymore. The modern era requires a new approach to teaching expert witnessing in consideration of the kinds of people and the kinds of sensibilities that they have today, that their particular generation has compared to previous generations, so that you're helping them develop the talents that they need that are based on the mindset that they have and the attitudes that they have about themselves. I want people to go into the courtroom and be impressive, be honest, have integrity, but be impressive. And if you can do that, you're going to do really, really well as an expert witness.
In testimony, and I've known many analysts that have been, I one time saw a person who was supervisory over me cross-train in DNA. She was a criminalist, and she cried during her mock testimony. She was so uncomfortable giving testimony. And that's a real thing. Fear of public speaking is a real thing. So then you can imagine when you're in a courtroom, in a court of law, with a proceeding that's as serious as a trial is, that's even more intimidating than just public speaking in front of Toastmasters. So it's a hard environment. You really have to, the only way to get through it is to get through it, is to do it, is to practice it.
I'm often surprised by how much individuals who might be very, very well trained and very, very experienced in, let's say, DNA, really struggle with their confidence on the witness stand, or they really struggle with their confidence in any kind of venue where they have to have a conversation that's a little bit complicated, or where they feel like they're going to be judged, their intelligence is going to be judged. And that's something that takes time to get over, and you have to sort of lean into those responsibilities and not let the moment bother you, but instead to see every appearance on the witness stand, every meeting that you attend with investigators or attorneys, it's an opportunity to contribute and to serve the cause of justice using your expertise. And I think that's a really cool thing about being a forensic expert, is you get to use science to help the cause of justice. You want to video record yourself giving a presentation, speaking, answering questions, whatever it may be. And then what you want to do is you want to watch the video and evaluate yourself. But then what you want to do is you want to watch the video with the sound turned all the way down. So all you're watching is the visual video portion of the recording. Then what you want to do is you want to close your eyes and you want to listen to the audio without watching the video. And that gives you sort of a full spectrum understanding of how you're performing. And if you do that, it's not always pleasant, but you're going to find some things that you can do to improve how you communicate, and you're going to recognize maybe some idiosyncrasies or little tics or quirks that you may have that you want to sort of get under control. But you need to be able to see yourself and hear yourself in order to be able to do that. It's very helpful.
Teach a class, join the Toastmasters, make yourself uncomfortable, talking about topics that interest you, using different words, what things work, what things don't. But testimony is definitely extremely hard for a lot of analysts, because it's not something that they necessarily consider when they're deciding whether they want to be a lab analyst. It's part and parcel with the job, but when I worked for the government lab, I didn't testify all that often. And so it's a small portion of cases where that happens, where they actually go to trial and then your testimony will be required.
Some scientists don't testify very often. It's not their fault. It's just that a lot of those cases, they plea out, never goes to trial. So only 5% go to trial, which surprises a lot of people when they learn that. So for those that don't go to testify very often, they have to work a little bit harder to sort of mentally prepare themselves for trial and to develop their skills. And so what I encourage those people to do is to work on communication, give presentations at conferences, write papers, think about your expertise, ask yourself questions that are difficult and see if you can answer your own questions. That's really something that really helped me. I was constantly asking myself difficult questions about the work that I did, and I found that translated over nicely to the courtroom.
That an expert, and quite clearly by virtue of their standing as an expert, knows more than the lay person, right? More than the juror. And so the jury looks at you as an interpreter, right? As their teacher, if you will, to what the evidence has to show. And if what I'm doing is limiting myself to what the science can support. A good part of my testimony, a good part of my report will discuss the limitations. Here's what I can't say. Here's what can't be said, period. Because that information doesn't exist, or it's a level of specificity that simply isn't supportable by the science. Because what can happen very easily is that I can stray into speculation. And if I'm not careful about that, the jury doesn't know the difference. The jury hears an opinion from somebody who's been voir dired as an expert. And so would they be wrong in thinking that anything I said was therefore an expert opinion? And so you have to be very careful to, and this is very, where the interplay between the expert and the attorneys is so important, because the attorney obviously wants to get as much from me as possible. And so I have to be very, very mindful about separating my opinion as an expert from my own sort of shoulder-shrugging speculation as a detective and as a human being.
It was a home invasion, middle of the day. This victim went home at lunch, and a burglar surprised her, and I guess she surprised the burglar, and the burglar sexually assaulted her and left in a car of some sort. And the police decided, for whatever reason, they were going to convict Thomas McGowan. And he was a young man back then. I've heard the police version, and they characterized him as a career criminal. But I think he was like 20. I mean, I don't know how much of a career can you have at anything at age 20. And if you look at his criminal history, he's not a career criminal at all. I don't think he had any prior felonies even, maybe some misdemeanors. But he was convicted twice. I think they tried him once for, they got this victim to pick him out of a faux spread. I think they tried him once for burglary and once for sexual assault. He got 2 life sentences that the judge stacked. So he's doing a life sentence, and then he has to do another life sentence. And so this was actually, Innocence Project in New York brought it to us when I was in the Dallas CIU and said, we want a DNA test. There's DNA, we want to test it. I'd never heard of the case. I said, okay, let's do our due diligence and, make sure that, we're trusting, but we're going to verify, And so we find it, we DNA test, and it comes back, it's not him. And then it was a strong enough profile, it was put into CODIS, the national database. And this is after we've already agreed to exonerate. I think it's after he's been exonerated. It's probably sitting at the Court of Criminal Appeals still, because it still has to go through that process. And there's a hit. And it comes back to a violent offender who was committing these kinds of crimes in the area at that time, and who is in prison out in West Texas somewhere. And we go out, my investigator goes out with the original detective in the case and interviews this guy. He gives a full confession on tape and apologizes to the victim, and then writes out a full confession apologizing to the victim. He was addicted to drugs and feels bad about it. So we were able to play that recording to the victim, and she said, that's when I realized that the wrong guy had been convicted, because I recognized the voice. And he said things in his confession that I've never told anybody. So I know that that is the guy who did it. And she and Thomas McGowan actually traveled around together, some speaking to law enforcement about reforming the way eyewitness identification is done. Now this is kind of an epilogue. My investigator in the CIU was a former Richardson police officer, so he had connections there. And he and the original detective went back and looked at the photo spread, and the actual perpetrator was in the photo spread. So that shows you how unreliable eyewitness identification is, because she had overlooked the actual perpetrator to point to someone who was completely innocent.